everyone. Welcome to the post-AGM Government Lawyers section special event. We have as our guest speaker today Kate Jenkins, from the Commissioner from the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. Before I introduce her, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Now, just a couple of pieces of business. The event is being recorded, which is why we'll be standing at the microphone, and there's also, as you can see, a photographer walking around taking photos for Law Institute Journal, so just so you know who they are and what they're doing. And there will be drinks and canapes and stuff served just after, so we can all have a bit of a chat when it's finished. And if you could please make sure your mobile phones are on silent, or quickly rush outside if you desperately need to answer them. So as I mentioned, we have Kate Jenkins here to talk to us today. Kate was appointed the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner in 2013. She brings 20 years' experience as a lawyer to the role. Prior to this, Kate was the lead partner of Herbert Smith Freehill's Australian Discrimination, Equal Opportunity and Training Practice. Kate is the Vice President of the Board of Berry Street Victoria, the state's largest independent child and family welfare organisation, and she's also a member of the board of Heide Museum of Modern Art. She holds honours degrees in law and arts. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you very much. And you can tell from that CV that I'm a relatively new public servant, so I had a lot longer time being a private sector lawyer than my current career. So I'll too start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The topic that I chose to talk about today was women in the public service. And really what I want to do is just talk to you briefly, this is just a short address, on some of the current stats and also propose some ideas for action. And so I thought it would be useful in terms of looking at this topic to look at women, the position of women generally in Australia, particularly looking at women in law and also women in the public service. And whilst the topic sounds like it's about women, the way I want to speak about it is really as an address to people who are leaders in their organisation and in the government lawyer area. So starting off with women in Australia, and I guess when I took this role, people said, why have you taken this on? So I'll take you back to 1968 when I was born. What was the position for women then? Women by law received 75% of the pay for the same job as a man. If you married, you would resign if you worked for the public service. Sexual harassment was lawful and pretty much commonplace. Participation of women in the paid workforce was low, and women carried almost 100% of the domestic and carer duties. So that was kind of the world I was born into. Some of you might remember and some of you might not. 1977 in Victoria we were one of the first states to get an Equal Opportunity Act, and I do recall, even though I was in primary school, there was a case involving Deborah Wardley. Does anyone here remember Deborah Wardley? Well, Deborah Wardley was a woman who wanted to become a pilot, and despite consistently applying for 2 years and being well and truly one of the best candidates, she was rejected consistently by Reg Ansett because she was a woman. So she was the first significant discrimination case in Australia, and in fact it made world news, and that was here in Victoria. It ended up going all the way to the High Court, and in 1979 it was found really clearly that it was sex discrimination, basically to say that a woman couldn't fly a plane because she was a woman. And the interesting reflection for me is I remember that case really clearly, although at the time I would have been 11. So it really stuck in my mind, just the outrage that, you know, just because I was a woman, I mightn't be able to do stuff. I had 2 brothers and I couldn't really see the difference between me and them. And if you watch Mad Men, so this will probably get more yeses, the show Mad Men, which starts I think in 59 and goes through, I'm anxiously awaiting the last DVD to come out to catch the end of season 7. People say, you'll look at that and you'll look at how gay people are treated, how different ethnic groups are treated, how women are treated, how someone with, a disability is basically ejected from the workplace. People will often say, things have really come along, isn't that terrific? My position at the point that I took this role on is no, it's not terrific. The fact that I'm not being sexually harassed every day now doesn't mean that I think this is all great. We've come a long way, but from my point of view, I think I should be being paid as much as the male equivalent. So we haven't really got there in terms of stats, or at least not enough from my perspective. So if you look at generally women in Australia, the position now is the gender pay gap is 18.2%. That means that although it is unlawful, on average, women get paid 81% of the male wage. As of October this year, 18.8% of appointments to ASX 200 boards were women, and 34 of those boards still have no women, and of those 200, I think only 7 are female CEOs. Superannuation payments for women are 57% of men. Women represent 70% of primary carers, and men who take on that role themselves experience significant discrimination. A woman is killed almost every week by a partner or ex-partner. 41% of women aged over 18 have experienced violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3 women have been sexually harassed since the age of 15, compared to fewer than 1 in 10 men. And a half of women who are parents and a quarter of men who are parents experience discrimination as a result of being a parent and a worker. And so in Australia, where we are now, we are ranked 34 and plummeting in the World Economic Forum on the Global Gender Gap Index. So things are not terrific at all. And most of that information, most of us don't come across all the time, but when you really look at it, there's no reason to be excited. When we go and look at particularly women in the law, there's similarly slow progress. So a few key stats there. So law graduates now across Australia, 67% of law graduates are women. And I know Chief Justice Marilyn Warren recently spoke at an event I was at, and she said the admissions she's doing are creeping up to 70% are women. 46% of those practising law today are women, and in the partner arena, 21% on average are partners. At the bar, looking at the Victorian bar in particular, 25% of Victorian barristers are women and 9% of silks are women. So that's compared to 70%, creeping to 70% graduates. By the time you get to the top of, a barristers would say, the cream of the crop, there's only 9% of women. We did some research a couple of years ago on the experience of women in law firms, and that told us that 25% of women had experienced sexual harassment whilst working as a lawyer, and much of that was in the first year of practice. 40% had experienced discrimination. That could be through unfair work allocation, unequal remuneration, hostile work environment or bullying. And the majority all said that they had been given flexible work on request, which is great news, but those by and large said the work was poorer quality with less career opportunities than if they'd remained full-time. So go to women in the public service, and this is an area where government has really been proud of the fact that it has had better results for women. But if I look at what's happening in our public sector and in politics, the experience now is patchy, and I think we shouldn't assume that because something's been good it will continue that way, or that it's naturally just going to get better over time. So just a couple of key stats there. Certainly the women on boards, so Australian government boards, 41.7% of those are held by women, which is much better than the 18.8% public private boards. In terms of the public service, looking just at the Victorian public service, 67% of public service employees are women, terrific, with only one female secretary, which we would all know. Now, the positive is you could say the proportion of female secretaries has just increased, but that's only because we've reduced the number of departments, which really helps the stats a little bit. And I know, having been in this role and met with some of the secretaries who are looking at this issue, they realise that in Victoria we were really a leader with people like Fran Thorne and Penny Armitage and Patricia Faulkner as secretaries, and suddenly we're just not at all in that position. We are down to a very token or representative one secretary. And then this makes the news all the time, but in the Victorian Parliament we have notably got a new government, and it is remarkable that there are 9 female Labor ministers to 13 men. It's exciting, and what it means is we're not spending our whole time thinking, is that the woman, because there's enough of them that that's kind of stopped being on the agenda. But at a cabinet level, it is really clear that there is only one female cabinet member there. So just to take you from those stats, and you won't have remembered them all, but I do somehow want you to remember one of them because it's Christmas time, and the end point of this is I want you at some cocktail party, even if it's here, to say, did you hear, isn't that remarkable? So something out of this I want to make you go, oh, I didn't know that, and tell someone else who will tell someone else. So women haven't progressed in the way we thought, and in particular I'm concerned that the public service is losing traction if you look at the experience with the federal cabinet in politics and the Victorian Secretary's position. So why, and what do we know now that we didn't know? There's 7 kind of things I would say over time in me looking at this issue that are becoming apparent. So the first one, which as lawyers we probably all will know, which is that laws are important, but they're not enough. They are not going to affect the change. So these laws, as I told you, came in 1977, and I was at that point in grade 4, and I would not have thought by this time I would be standing here saying, you know, things are still not that terrific for women, or at least not equal for women. So I think there was a sense that the laws will come in and this will be fixed over time. It will just evolve. It hasn't eliminated the issue of inequality, and what we now know is social change is required, that some deliberate discrimination doesn't happen, but there's a whole lot of other factors at play that leave us with an unequal situation. The second thing we know, and I'm sure half of you at least have gone along to an unconscious bias session, is that unconscious bias is having a huge impact on the progression of women and on how women are perceived and judged and assessed in terms of performance and potential. And this is not about men. This is something in terms of how our brain develops that we all have. So the idea really is, if you're not consciously thinking about diversity, we are all probably unconsciously excluding particular people. I'll just do a quick raise of hands. Who's been to an unconscious bias session? That's interesting. Okay, I'll do the really speedy version of unconscious bias, and don't hold me to this. But the bottom line is unconscious bias is this way our brains develop. When we are born, there is so much information out in the world. The way we develop is to learn a way to make connections between things so that our brains can take all that information in. So from birth, we are making connections and sorting things out. And that is gives us a way of thinking shorthand information to save us time, and in many situations that really helps us deal with a situation and get stuff done. In practice, the best practical example is most of us will have developed an unconscious bias that connects women more quickly with family or home and men more quickly with work, and that is because a lot of our worlds will have sent us that message. So that we all have that. We also might connect certain behaviours with women, behaviours with men. So to give you a practical example of unconscious bias, there was a study that was published earlier this year in the Smithsonian magazine about hurricanes. So would you be surprised to hear that female named hurricanes are 3 times more deadly than male named hurricanes? So that is true, and just to give you an idea, so that research excluded Katrina and Audrey, which were the 2 real biggies, and that research, what that research found, so hurricanes are named alternatively. They don't say, gee, this is a big one, quick, give it a woman's name, it's out of control, here's a calm one, let's give it a man's name. What they found is people prepare quite differently for a male named hurricane over a female named hurricane. So they expect a more ferocious hurricane from a male name, and they will prepare differently, they will more likely evacuate, and so there's less death and destruction as a result of the preparation. So Hurricane Arthur, you are going to lock down. Hurricane Dolly, not so much. That sounds much nicer. What that is telling us is, even if it's not in your own interest, men and women will make the same make the same sort of assessments and not even mean to do it. So in practice, what we see, and I'll just use one example, there's no science behind this example, it's just an observation that I've sort of had in the last week, is that we will, for example, there's lots of views that we will be more critical of a woman behaving in a certain way, where a man might behave in exactly the same way, but our gender stereotyping will say that's leadership for a man, that's a woman being a pain in the butt. So that in the last week or two, and even though I'm in this role, I'm not very political. And actually the more I'm in this role, I'm less political. I just want to get on with my work, I've got to say. But I said to my husband's American, and he can't stand politics. He comes from a country he can't understand. You have a minister and a shadow minister. Like, what's the shadow minister doing? Just disagreeing with the minister who's trying to do the job. You know, that's not how the American system works, so he's not really into it. So I said to him yesterday at breakfast, do you know who Tony Abbott's chief of staff is? And he said, yes, Peter Credlin. And I said, and what do you know about her? And he said, she looks really vicious and, you know, aggressive. And I said, okay, do you know who Rudd's chief of staff was? And you can imagine. No. Do you know who Gillard's chief of staff was? And I know there was more that no. Do you know who Howard's chief of staff was? He's been here for 25 years. No. And so we started having a conversation. I said, the media seems to be delivering to us Peter Credlin in a particular way that to me seems quite gendered. What I know about her is she wears stilettos. I'm really clear on that. She looks pretty glamorous, and apparently she is bullying Tony Abbott to do what she wants him to do. So there's a media, for me, in terms of that unconscious bias, that really reflects that kind of gendered expectation on what a woman would do in that role, which I suspect if a man was doing the same thing would not be of note for us in the newspaper. Just a theory of my own that I'm canvassing with you, but it's just an observation on what we get delivered to us. Thirdly, what do we know? Leaders are important. So lots of our organisations have policies and procedures and training programs and a whole lot of things, but I would say from my 20 years working for a whole range of different organisations, that the organisations that made change in this area did so because the leader said, we need to do this. And a good example is ANZ under John McFarlane, Mike Smith, that there is someone who's saying, yep, that's the policies, but I'm expecting you to do something about that. I'm going to measure you. I'm not letting go. We do a lot of work with Ken Lay, who is exactly the same. He is completely consistent and clear on what needs to be done. Fourthly, the other thing that we now know is we all have a role to play. So you would have heard lots of information about bystanders, which is really about what other people, when something happens, what other people do really matters. So the siege this week in Sydney, what also has made the news is that hashtag I'll ride with you, which is really people saying, if you feel unsafe, you know what, I'll stand by you. Now, in the past, I think people have thought that, but what we now know is if someone does something really small, it can change a whole culture. And I think up until now, certainly the way this area has evolved over time has been there have been some people who are really passionate and really push hard on these issues. From my perspective, that's still important, but to make the big cultural change I need everyone here. Everyone needs just to be mildly interested, know a couple of those stats I said, and then when something happens that you think that's not okay, you say, that wasn't acceptable, and you move on. So the difference will be we'll still have those passionate people, but your passion might be your kid's soccer or environment or whatever it might be, but still you have a sense about what's the sort of community you want to live in, and your small action collectively will probably have more impact than one big rah-rah response. Fifthly, we know it won't fix itself. So I think I've covered that we've had a good 35 years and it didn't get sorted out by natural evolution. And in fact, a lot of the work I'm doing at the top end of town in corporate and public sector is working really strategically on how can we get more women in leadership. But I'm really conscious that meanwhile I have 2 children who are being marketed to in such a gendered way, and in fact in a way that I never was. So if I want to buy a Lego, my brother and my Lego sets look the same, and you built a house and a car and they were red and blue and yellow and green. Now my daughter's is a house, it's all pink. My son's is Star Wars or a rocket or something exciting. And there's really good commercial reasons why they want those children to be buying different things. So my sense is the unconscious bias that's been imprinted in our children doesn't match kind of the change that we're trying to make at the top. And similarly with the media, without us realising we're getting a whole lot of different messages about who should be doing what. 6th, and this is my second last point, there's lots of research now that discrimination harms. So my father recently, having taken on this role, so my father's an 82-year-old retired farmer, orchardist originally, now a beef farmer. It's pretty a country attitude to things. And the other day, or it was at the start of the year, and I think there was another one of those racist comments at the footy. He said, now, Kate, does that saying sticks and stones, that doesn't apply anymore. So he grew up with sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And so I listened to him, and rather than get into a huge philosophical discussion, I said, no, it doesn't apply. What we know is names do hurt. We know that casual racism, a relentless experience of discrimination. We know people who are same-sex attracted, particularly young people, living with high degrees of mental health and high rates of suicide. And we know that kind of ongoing comments and conduct really harms our community and our fellow members. But the flip side of that, which is my last thing about what we know, is we do really know that diversity can benefit us. It can benefit us individually, it benefits organisations, and it actually benefits the community, both by reducing the public health cost of discrimination, but also increasing the economic benefit. If we were to close the gender pay gap, it will make a huge difference to our GDP. So there's a lot of benefits that say that this is kind of a no-brainer if we would all just be a little bit interested in it. So what can you do? And I'll be interested in drinks and you can tell me what you can do. I spoke to my comms manager who helps me with the speeches, and I kind of said, this is what I'm going to say. Okay, just what can I tell them? What can they do? She'll say, I don't think you've got the answer for that, Kate. But here's what I would ask you to think about doing. Firstly, educate yourself a little bit more on this sort of stuff. On my way here, I tweeted just when I was thinking about this, some of the stuff that really interests me in terms of thinking about these issues. So there's I obviously read the books on these things, but there's a good TEDx talk for everything. There's fascinating talk by Laura Bates, who set up Everyday Sexism, great, Sheryl Sandberg as a ex-corporate lawyer is really good on kind of talking about those, the gender stereotyping and what's stopping progression. Jackson Katz is fascinating on violence against women and particularly talking about what role men have to play in that. So those are just a few suggestions. There's lots of great people around. Secondly is I'd ask you to see if you can identify one action you could take. So you mightn't be the CEO, and I come back to leaders are important, but you definitely are in the same community as me. So you might want to speak to a senior manager at your organisation and ask what's going on there. You might want to speak up when something happens in your workplace. You might want to question a decision that might be affected by bias because it involves so much manager discretion, for example. And last is I'd encourage you to not be a bystander or not be a silent bystander, that realise that you have a huge impact in whatever you do in the smallest possible ways. So I know that I'm sure that at the football there's a whole lot less racist things happening, but we hear about a whole lot more of them because someone in the crowd says that's not okay. And it takes courage and you need to feel safe. But those small actions are making a big difference to our community, and in the current climate that we're in, that's really important. So that's all I wanted to cover today. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take questions now or to have a chat after this. One question.